Hola a todos, muy buenos días. Me da gusto saludarlos. Yo soy la doctora Samanta Varela, soy profesora titular del Seminario de Instituciones, Sociedad Civil y Política Pública del Colegio Mexiquense. El día de hoy estoy contenta porque continuamos el ciclo de conferencias titulado El futuro, el cambio y la política pública local. Tenemos con nosotros al doctor Charlie F. Thompson, a quien voy a presentar en inglés. La conferencia se va a llevar a cabo en inglés. Vamos a hacer una prueba para poner subtítulos en español. Les agradezco mucho por su paciencia con esto. I'm going to switch to English now. Good morning, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome everyone joining us from Mexico and probably also from Norway. It is a great pleasure to welcome you to this new session of the lecture series, The Future, Change, and Local Public Policy. This is a space dedicated to fostering dialogue and critical reflection on the evolving challenges of public action. So today we're very honored to host Dr. Charlie F. Thompson, who will present the lecture Public Policy Change, Alternatives to Traditional Analytical Frameworks. Dr. Thompson he researches public policy and administration at the Department of Sociology and Political Science in the the Norwegian University of Science and Technology. His core research interests include policy process research, public administration and management, and regulation of public policy. Dr. Thompson coordinates research activities within the research group OPA. He's a member of the Interdisciplinary Research Group Organization and Society and a group member of the research group coordination within NTNU's thematic area on civil security. In the fall of 2024, Dr. Thompson was a visiting scholar at the Center for Policy and Democracy School of Public Affairs at CU Denver, and his research has been published in international journals such as Policy Sciences, the International Journal of Public Administration, and Journal of Comparative Policy Analysis. His presentation today is actually based in one of his articles at the latter journal. Just as a quick introduction, I want to say that one of the main theories that we use to understand policy change sees change like the product of attention and information processing flows, and change is thought to occur after periods of stasis and in an incremental and punctuated manner. But Dr. Thompson's work is drawing on a different perspective that he's going to explain right now. His comparative case analysis of gambling policy trajectories shows us a different way to understand how to study change. So welcome, Dr. Thompson. Thank you for being here. You can start your presentation now.
Thank you so much for the pleasant introduction, and thank you so much for being here. So my presentation is titled Policy Change as an Analytical Problem, where I will first go through a more generic overview of what we can understand as policy change before I then delve more into my own research. And as Samantha said, I'm a researcher in political science at the Norwegian University of Science and Technology, and looking forward to present today. So I think before we delve into the more the nuts and bolts of policy change, I think we need to understand policy change as an analytical phenomenon. So I think the most apparent question is why should we care about policy change? Why is this a theme and thematic area of research in public policy that we are interested in? I think you can contend that policy change is arguably the central area of inquiry when it comes to research on public policy. The interest is quite basic. We want to understand how, to what extent, when, why, and under what conditions do specific public policies change. It's obviously quite important because the outcome or the outputs from policy processes, it determines who gets what, when they get what, and how these processes unfold. However, I would propose or contend that despite the prominence and the importance of policy change as a thematic area of inquiry, the theme of policy change continues to be contested. I think there's a range of contrasting definitions that have their consequences. You could argue that the accumulated knowledge of what constitutes a change and not is quite scattered. And I think we can also argue that everything matters, that it kind of depends also on the context, and research on policy change has been kind of this never-ending puzzle. So I think there's a lot of unfinished business when it comes to policy change, and it's a quite interesting topic to understand as scholars of political science, public policy, and the broader social sciences. So I'll just first present the overview of the presentation. So I will first go through some key challenges that I think any researcher faces. I think there's a range of analytical considerations to be taken when we research policy change. These range from the conceptual ones, the theoretical ones, the methodological ones, and the empirical areas. And then I will also then present my own paper, and then also maybe propose some future avenues for policy change, and hope that we can have a dialogue on what we consider the interesting aspects of policy change. And I think I'll propose 4 key areas of what any researcher has to grapple with and think about or consider when they're working with policy change. So I think the first one is obvious. I think you have to define the boundaries and borders of what constitutes change and not. This has very clear implications for your research. Secondly, I think there's a key theoretical challenge. I think you need to articulate what can explain change, the relationship between different concepts, and then also as a type of reasoning as for why change has or not occurred. Thirdly, the research designs and the choices one takes to examine policy change are important. And fourthly, the data measurement and case setting where you argue policy change occurs is important. So if we start off with some of the conceptual challenges when we research policy change, I think these are quite important, and these kind of allude to a lot of choices you make when defining what is policy change. So I think the most important thing, or one of the most important things when you're researching policy change, is to define the boundaries of what constitutes change or not. I think one of the reasons I argue why the accumulated knowledge on policy change is quite scattered is because there's quite a range of different definitions and ways to differentiate what change is. So I think one of the earlier ones is from Paul Sabatier on differentiating between major and minor change. Peter Hall has what he calls the first, second order, and third order of change, which alludes to different ways of conceptualizing policy instruments, paradigm change, and policy goals, and different ways to understand change. We have what you can call incremental change, path-dependent change, or radical change, which also denotes what type of policy change we are talking about. You also have what we can call for transformative change. I think lastly, we also have an important aspect which relates to what are the internal versus the external factors that produce change. You have the endogenous mechanisms and you have the exogenous mechanisms. So this therefore means that we have to undertake a range of considerations. Some scholars are interested in the major grand scale changes. Others are interested in the more nitty-gritty, smaller pathways that enable certain changes. Some are interested in a longitudinal perspective of how changes evolve over time, whereas others are very interested in kind of this major one-off event. So in sum, there's a range of different ways to conceptualize change and different areas of research where you can understand change. And you can also consider policy change as an outcome, as like the final analytical step. You can consider it as an independent variable, as like a window of opportunity to achieve specific goals. You can consider policy change as a process, as a natural part of political life that is embedded in a longer trajectory of policy. And as I already mentioned, you can consider change as a one-off or as a punctuation or also a culmination of multiple events. So there are a range of considerations one needs to take. I think importantly, the temporal considerations are important. So how can we understand change in the longer trajectory of a policy. So take, for instance, social policy. It's embedded of a lot of different policies within social policy, but it also has a long history of different policies over time, different eras of social policy. So how do you consider policy change in a longer trajectory is important. And also if you consider change strictly as an outcome of or a culmination of processes. I think also another thing I would also raise attention to is the contextual considerations. Obviously, any public policy, area of policy domains, they are embedded in a kind of broader macro level political environment. So you can consider how do these kind of broader political landscape matter? How does the economy matter? How does multi-level settings, for instance, the UN or the European Union or the WHO, how do these kind of multi-level national institutions impact policy change? And I think also public opinion, the public mood surrounding a particular policy also matters. So in any case, there's a range of conceptual issues one needs to address. I wouldn't say there's a best practice. It's just there's a range of different areas of thematic interest in conceptualizing policy change. So I will return to a bit later to how I kind of I'm trying to conceptualize policy change. But in any case, as a researcher, you need to have a very clear relationship with the conceptualization of change, and you have to specify what type of change or what type of thematic area you're trying to understand when researching change. Secondly, I think there's a range of theoretical considerations one needs to undertake. These are very central, particularly how you articulate the process or the way policy change unfolds. It's very critical to understand the relationship between different theoretical building blocks and how these can explain policy change. And this relates to what I can consider the conceptual formation and the interrelation between different dimensions, variables, or different key characteristics of policymaking. For instance, how do you consider the relationship between institutions and actors, or how ideas, interests, resources impact both actors or institutions? How specific contextual factors or crises or different ways of understanding policy, how are these interacting, and how do these culminate in an explanation of policy change? So these areas are quite important to think more thoroughly through. So how can you theoretically articulate, for instance, the policy change unfolding within a specific institutions? How are these actors influencing policy change? Are there any narratives, policy ideas, institutional ways of understanding policy that hinder or impinge policy change? Do these interests, do they influence policy change, and what are the resources available? And then we can also consider the more peculiar features of the political system. If we take, for instance, Norway and we take Mexico, they have very clear contextual differences that make Norway Norway and Mexico Mexico. So it's important to theorize how do these conditions that based on the Norwegian political system or the Mexican political system, how do they influence the process towards change? Secondly, I think you also need to consider time, space, and context, and how your explanation of policy change relates to a longer trajectory of policy. Some scholars advocate for, if you really want to understand change, you need to study policy and the dynamics of policy over a decade or more. While this is not necessarily necessary, it's important to understand the relationship between your study and your particular time period, with a broader understanding of policy over time, and also the time and space where change unfolds. And I think as anyone would argue, is that it's very important to have some type of hypothesis, assumptions, or expectations that guide the study. Your theoretical reasoning should be kind of pointing forward to what we can kind of expect from the empirical phenomena we're studying. And obviously, it's very important to have clear, convincing theoretical arguments that plausibly explains the culmination of specific events and the mechanisms that produce them and how we can understand change. And I think another important aspect is the never-ending debate regarding structure versus agency. And I think it is also a theoretical exercise to position yourself. Do you want to have more of an actor-oriented explanation? Do you draw more structural perspectives, or how is this interrelation? To illustrate, I'll just shortly go through two kind of dominant ways of understanding policy change. The first one is the structure-oriented theories, and you can consider these for instance, institutional theories. In theoretical reasoning of trying to explain change, often an institutional scholar would highlight the institutional constraints that define and confine policy change. For instance, they would study issues such as path dependency. So how is policy change kind of the culmination of previous decision makings, which shapes the future decision making? Are there critical junctures where policy kind of drifts off or it breaks out? Can we consider kind of policy change as layering or drifting away from the original ideas? And I think structured theories, such as institutional theories, they argue quite clearly that actors are quite constrained by the institutional arrangement, where often we would consider that initial design elements of policies, they have a remarkable ability to persist and they inform future policy selections. So previous decisions, they have a way of shaping future ways policy evolves. And I think a second aspect we can consider is these actor-oriented theories. One theory we can understand this through is the lens of the advocacy coalition framework, which argues that change is is kind of shaped by actor dynamics and how strategic interactions influence policy development. They can differentiate between what we can consider minor change, where you shift your beliefs over time, which then leads to policy change because of updated information. Policy change can unfold through what we can consider crisis-induced policy change through the external mechanisms, external shocks, specific crises, disasters that influence policy development. And the actor-oriented theories, they would maybe argue that structure, they act as stabilizing factors where the the dynamics of actors, coalitions, resources, they are the drivers of policy change, where it's the actors that are kind of driving the policy. I think the third consideration we can make when researching policy change is the methodological concerns. These relate to different challenges, considerations when you employ a specific research design. I think it's very important to leverage the strengths of various approaches. I think you can kind of consider a few different approaches. The first one is what you can consider the case-based approaches. So you have in-depth explanations of one or few cases where you really try and understand the processes, the mechanisms that produce policy change in a range of or a select few areas of policy. They have some strengths where they can really explain the within case processes of change. However, you can also consider the strengths of variance-based approaches, where you have the aggregated patterns of change, where you try to assess change across a select or a larger number of cases. And these also have other ways of understanding change, where you can really understand the generalizability of change. And then I think thirdly, you can consider interpretive approaches, which aim to understand the thick contextual and meaning making of policy to try and make sense of policy. These explanations, they really give you a contextual understanding of why changes unfold in a particular area, and the aim is really to explore what change can mean. And I think in any case, whatever type of approach you draw on, you should really try and leverage the strengths, because each research design, they have their own strengths. However, they also have some key limitations. So you have to kind of consider both the strengths, but also the limitations. For one, I think the case-based research approach can often have a case selection bias. So, for instance, as a scholar from Norway, I may want to understand policy change in a Norwegian political case. However, I'm kind of often then analytically choosing this case of Norway for practices other than what can be considered best practices, but because of my convenience of Norway. So we then often have what you can call the dependent variable problem so I know that there is a change in Norway, and this can lead to some issues. So I think you really have to think thoroughly through why you select the case. Why is it both methodologically and theoretically interesting to draw on this case? And how can we then understand change based on these considerations? The variance-based approaches, they also have some limitations. I think the first one relates to what we can call this obsession with covariance. So you both have a lot of variance on the independent variables, and then also a lot of variance on the dependent variables. So, for instance, you're trying to understand how the economy produces change in fiscal policy. You try to understand these changes in maybe 20 different countries, and you have a very large variance in some economic conditions that influence change, and you have a very large influence or variance in change itself. So you kind of have this covariance design, which provides a lot of challenges when trying to understand aggregated patterns. And I think the interpretive approach also has some issues you need to consider, such as what are actually the important factors that matter for producing change. Thick descriptions and meaning making sense of change is important, but you also have to try and point forward to what are the important conditions or characteristics that kind of produce specific change. So I think in any case, when you're studying policy change, it's very important to leverage the strengths, but also think about the key limitations of different research designs. And fourthly, there are also some empirical choices, and these relate to how do we measure and operationalize change? If we go back to the conceptual debate I started earlier, what do we constitute as change? Is it this minor, major distinction? Is it this first, second, third order distinction? Is it exogenous forms of change, endogenous, internal factors? And I think the most important thing is then to understand or make decisions on how you construct important variables or factors that explain change. Or do you identify this prior to empirically studying it? Or do you have a bottom-up identification where as you study this issue, you come over factors that actually explain it? And I think this distinction is very important to empirically think about when you're doing research. And I think also it's important to limit the selection bias. So obviously, if you want to understand change, you pick cases where change is evident. But I think it's also important to understand those cases and periods of policy development where there is no change, and try and understand the factors that then produce change in one area but not in another one. I think that's very important. And I think you also need to make some empirical considerations on is this a case of a long-term policy adoption, or is this an abrupt policy shift that is kind of down to a specific point in time? So you really need to try and understand how these abrupt policy shifts don't necessarily are not necessarily that abrupt if you look into the longer trajectory of policy, where you can see the trends or the symptoms that lead up to this policy change. Or can you convincingly empirically show that this is an isolated policy event that really transpired because of specific processes at one point in time? And I think another point that's really important to think about is how to balance the more generalizability versus the contextual considerations. So I think in any case, a range of political institutional systems, they they exhibit unique dynamics. However, how do these unique contextual dynamics, how do they actually influence policy change, and how can we understand the more general aspects of policy change that is not necessarily contingent on the contextual considerations? And I think obviously it's, as any case, it's very important to think about the transparency and analytical procedures with how you actually understand change and how you study change. But I think that goes without saying. So now I will I'll move over to my study based on the article published in the Journal of Comparative Policy Analysis, JCPA, on what you can call the multiple concurrent policy processes. So with these four considerations or challenges in the back of our head, I'm going to try and talk a bit about some of my analytical considerations on how I try and assess change compared to the more general lessons we can consider. So I think one of my main arguments in my article is about understanding the processual consideration of change, where change is not the analytical endgame. It's rather an ongoing iterative process and a normal part of political life. It's not the culmination of events, but it's kind of something you can consider in the longer trajectory of policies. And this conceptual consideration, it has a lot of influence over how you then conduct your study. If you argue that policy change is a processual aspect, or it can be understood from a processual perspective, you need to zoom out, not on just a one-off event or one policy process, but you need to understand the trajectory and the longitudinal design of policy and how multiple policy processes are interacting. And I think when you have this kind of conceptual backbone in your article or the way you understand policy change, some of the theoretical considerations must also then kind of reflect these conceptual ways of understanding change. So in my article, I argue that I kind of draw on a more institutional framework, where I also then try and consider relevant policy theories and factors from these. But I think with this kind of processual understanding, trying to then understand how institutional arrangements and previous decisions, how they shape the future of policy. And particularly in my article, I argue that the presence or absence of multiple concurrent policy processes, as in policy processes that are happening at the same time, for instance, at different levels of government, how these then influence policy change. And I will come back to this with how I did this. I think there are also some methodological considerations. So given that I wanted to understand change as an ongoing iterative process, and not as an analytical endgame, I think the longitudinal policy development perspective is important. So understanding different phases of a particular policy, you can consider like a 10-year perspective as it has a very different it has a very different way of researching a policy when you take a 20-year perspective compared to one policy process that might transpire over a 2-3 year period. And I think what I was really interested in was trying to understand these policy trajectories in a comparative case study. So trying to understand how did Norway's gambling policy compare to Finland, Sweden, and Denmark's policy in gambling develop over time, and see different phases of each policy and see where did they kind of converge, where did they diverge, what trajectory did the policy take, and based on this, we can see multiple iteration of change over time with different ways of understanding the kind of the trajectory of policy. And I think there is a range of empirical considerations. So if you want to have a longitudinal design, you can obviously, there's a lot of different data and ways to understand change. But so what I was really thinking about was trying to have comparable data. And I think in any case, all the 4 countries I was interested in studying, they had very similar political processes with proceedings in parliament. They had expert committees, they had public opinions, hearing opinions. And these policy processes are quite institutionally similar, so it was quite comparable data, and that helps when you're trying to understand change, because then you limit and you don't have to isolate the institutional or contextual differences. It limits the kind of institutional differences that explain change. I think some of the empirical considerations I was trying to understand was to understand various pathways towards change or not. So the paper also then tries to argue that there's not just one way of a policy changing, but there can be multiple ways, and some changes are contingent on specific factors. But also that some cases you don't see the same type of change. So I think this setup is quite nice, because then you see some differences and similarities, and then trying to understand and distill these become very important. And some of the figures from the paper, which illustrate some of the things I've been talking about. So figure 1, it illustrates the theoretical arguments on how partly overlapping policy processes, they are important for driving change. So I argue that when there is multiple partly overlapping policy changes, this heightens the chance of policy change compared to when there is an absence of these, which simplifies policy, and then it's easier for institutional arrangements to confine and block changes. And then figure 2 kind of illustrates empirically the differences in policy change and policy trajectories. So apologies for it's not maybe the best figure to see online, but it kind of stipulates that two contexts, they have a very similar trajectory towards policy change. Whereas once you can see Finland, it kind of takes this different pathway through first kind of safeguarding its institutional arrangement before you have a sudden shift. And then you see this absence of change in this Norwegian context. So the aim is to then try and understand these different periods and different events that ultimately then transpire into change or not change over time. And I think to end the presentation, I think there are some important area of research that is needed, and I think we can maybe talk more about it after the presentation. So I think one area which I think is a challenge at the moment is there's the lack of integrated research agenda on policy change. There's a range of ways to understand policy change, which I consider a strength of the domain. However, we need to try and integrate this and see what are the trade-offs or what are the different ways to understand change, and what does one perspective give you compared to another one to build some type of accumulated knowledge or state-of-the-art of policy change. I think one interesting issue is related to these first, second, and third order changes. So is it necessary for a policy change to occur that, for instance, the policy instruments change first, or is it necessary that the policy goals change first, or how can we understand different orders of change, and what are the kind of conditions that are necessary to activate particular changes? I think thinking more about the sequential aspects of policy change and what contributes to change in different contexts is quite important. And I think this is an area where public policy research could be quite strengthened. And I think we need to also zoom out and maybe stop thinking about only change, but we also need to understand change in kind of relation to the relative stability, the continuity of policy, and understand how different phases of a policy can be more stable, others are more unstable and produce different changes. So employing more longitudinal designs with various forms of methods, both quantitatively and qualitatively, to understand change in different phases of a policy, because I think it's very easy to look into what's happening now and what has changed over the last few years, but can we understand any general patterns from a longer perspective? And I think one area I didn't talk too much about today, but I think in any case it highlights the exogenous and external factors. So, for instance, how does democratic backsliding, external events, macro level politics, how does this influence policy change on specific policy programs? So I think increasingly we see policy termination as a trend in governance. And how does this kind of change in stable parameters? How does this influence policy change? So with that, I think I'll just wrap up. I think it's very important to acknowledge that the study of policy change, it entails of a lot of analytical considerations, which you as the researcher have to understand, and it's your responsibility to consider. For instance, how do we differentiate between these very contrasting ways of understanding policy change in the literature, and where do you position yourself? We also need to consider these conceptual choices, the theoretical reasoning, the methodological concerns, and the empirical considerations. So what constitutes change? What does not constitute change? How do we understand the relationship between different theoretical concepts, and how do these together explain change? I think you need to consider the strengths of a particular research design, but also the limitations, and try and understand both together to understand change. And I think lastly, measuring and operationalizing change and trying to understand the contextual aspects versus the more general aspects is also important. So to wrap up, here are some of the references if you're interested in reading up on different ways. And yeah, thank you for your attention, and yeah, I look forward to a dialogue. Thank you.
Charlie, thank you so much for the presentation. I'm giving you an applause in the name of everyone watching. This was it was an excellent presentation. I don't use this word lightly. I think you have given us a very complete panorama of how we can analyze policy change from different perspectives. And I really liked how you structured your presentation and made us think of the conceptual, methodological, and empirical, and theoretical and empirical aspects. I'm going to see if we have any questions on the chat. So far, we don't have any. So there is one here by Professor Cecilia Cadena. She's in the Seminar of Institutions, Civil Society and Public Policy at Colegio, and she's asking about what you think. Let me see how I can better translate this. I would like to know what you think, because you say that the elements of interpretation, narratives, and context are decisive in public policy analysis. So how do you how would you put the network focus of policy? I think she means the social network, focus on social networks, it would be like, what is the importance of social networks in this analysis?
Yeah, so I think it really depends on what your research
Sorry,
goal.
sorry for the interruption. Policy networks, she says.
Yeah, so I think it really depends on what your aims are. What is your research question? So if you're trying to understand how policy networks influence policy change, I think you have to consider the interactions between actors. You have to think about the coordination ties. You have to think about policy beliefs or policy interests, policy resources. And when then studying policy change specifically, you need to then think about the relationship between these elements. So how do coordination ties, resources, actor interactions, and influence, and these different things, how are they interrelated with each other, and how do these together then explain change? So I think if you take a network perspective, for instance, really understanding interaction patterns. So what are considered groups of allies? What are considered groups of opponents? How do you differentiate between different factions of actors, and how do these different factions or different actor groups, what are the dynamics between these? And I think you can really understand the policy change by trying to understand if there's a dominant group of actors. And yeah, there's very different ways to understand social networks. But I think for me, thinking about the relationship between these different factors I mentioned, and then trying to understand through, yeah, you can have social network analysis methods. You can try and map the beliefs of different actors and really try and understand the resources. So it's kind of a hard question to answer without thinking about what the kind of analytical purpose or the interest you have. But I think, yeah, in any case, you have to be very transparent and specific about what you consider important. And then if you are interested in policy networks, then I think you should state that very clearly, that you are trying to understand the relative importance of policy networks on policy change. And then it's also then fine not to consider all aspects of policy making, such as institutions or other aspects. So yeah.
She's saying thank you and congratulating you. This is an excellent conference and it has been very clarifying. Charlie, while we have more questions on the chat, I want to ask you, you presented a series of possibilities for deciding on how to do a proper analytic design to understand change. And for example, some of the choices that you have to make for creating or selecting your variables. Can you tell us a bit more about what was your own process of how that did that come about in the research that you're presenting?
Yeah, so I think for me, I was quite curious to understand. So I'm researching gambling policy, and I was quite interested in understanding why some countries they wanted to transition towards a license-based regime where a range of private actors could offer gambling, whereas other countries they preferred to safeguard and uphold their public monopoly. So I was quite puzzled, why do these very similar countries exhibit different kind of approaches to gambling, considering their long history of similarities? So then for me it was very important then to understand the longer period, the longitudinal aspect. So given that they had been similar, I was trying to really examine the patterns where different countries suddenly diverge and what could explain this divergence. So for me, I was then researching these countries extensively, and then I kind of had to think about kind of my theoretical reasoning, how did I think the different countries kind of diverge, and then I kind of came up thinking about this multiple concurrent policy processes where there's no real intrinsic motivation for one of the countries to transition over the other, but it had something to do with um, the absence or appearance of multiple concurrent processes that influenced or kind of led to policy change or not. So I think for me it was really important understanding the longitudinal aspect. And it was really important to also consider different pathways towards change. So it wasn't just sufficient to explain that policy change had occurred or not, but also then to understand, okay, different countries, they can end up with the same analytical endgame, as in policy change has occurred, but the pathways necessary to enacting policy change, they can be very different. And then really trying to then understand these differences became important.
Thank you so much. That is very useful. It's going to be very useful for our students as well. Charlie, I don't see any more questions in the chat. I just want to tell you that we appreciate your presence in this conference so much. Congratulations on your article. We're going to follow your work, I'm sure. I'm going to switch to Spanish briefly. Muchas gracias a todos por estar en esta conferencia. Me parece que ha sido muy interesante. El doctor Thompson nos ha presentado una serie de opciones que tenemos para hacer un análisis sobre el cambio de política pública, ya sea como un factor endógeno, como un factor exógeno, más como una cosa que ocurre de manera puntuada o como un proceso, sobre todo como un proceso que ocurre a través del tiempo, de manera longitudinal. Les recomiendo mucho que vean esta presentación para conocer todos los aspectos que nos presenta y todas las opciones que nos presenta de cómo analizar el cambio de política pública. There's another question. Dr. Cadena is asking if we can have access to your article. Maybe I'm going to connect the two of you. I'm going to put the link in the chat.
So the article is actually open access. So if you visit the Journal of Comparative Policy Analysis, Research and Practice, they have their own website, and you can find the article there in open access. So in theory, anyone should be able to open and see the article. But I can also send you it if you send me an email.
Okay, maybe I'll just, I'll just put the link in the chat then. We're really lucky that it's open access. Here it is. So, otra vez voy a hablar en español. El doctor Thompson nos comparte la liga de su artículo, es acceso abierto, entonces, bueno, es muy recomendable que lo veamos. Y junto con esta presentación creo que tendremos una muy buena base para entender el cambio de política pública. Les agradezco mucho a todos por estar acá. Y bueno, los invito también a que sigan esta serie de conferencias sobre el cambio, el futuro y las políticas públicas locales. Hasta el momento hemos tenido una primera sesión que nos habló acerca de cómo cambió la política digital en República Dominicana. Esta presentación fue más analítica y más, vaya, nos permite como aterrizar la primera conferencia en una forma más académica y más sistemática. Y las siguientes conferencias van a estar más enfocadas a hablar acerca de cómo ocurre esto en el nivel local y un poco acerca de la cuestión prospectiva, la cuestión de futuro. Thank you very much, Charlie. And we'll see you. We'll follow your work and we'll see you later.
Thank you for the invitation. I much appreciate it.
Thank you to everyone who attended as well. Charlie, I'm going to send you a diploma. I'll be in touch.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for the invitation.